Morning, everybody. How are you? And welcome to the breakfast session. Great to see you all here this morning on rather a fresh morning. We're very pleased to welcome our colleague Carl Sherwood from UQ. He's come down from Brisbane to talk to us about storytelling and teaching statistics, not two things that you would normally find together in the same sentence, but Carl's going to explain the juxtaposition for us. Before we start, I'd just like to acknowledge country. I'd like to acknowledge that this meeting is being held on the traditional lands of the Kaurna people, and we pay our respects to elders both past and present. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Carl. Thanks, Carl.
Okay, thank you, Stuart, and good morning, everybody. Thanks for having me down here. I lived in Adelaide in 1996 and 97, working on the Marion Westfield Shopping Centre, so it's great to be back after that time. So just before we begin, just very briefly about myself. Actually a structural engineer from way back. I studied at UQ as an undergrad, 1980 to 84, worked as a professional civil engineer for 15 years. High-rise buildings, expensive houses, and of course Westfield shopping centres, of which I probably worked on over $2.5 billion worth of projects for 15 years or so. Having done that, I then went and did an MBA at UQ, and that exposed me to economics and students studying statistics. So I became particularly interested in that. So when I finished the MBA, I had the opportunity to go back to UQ and start teaching. So I particularly was interested in that, so I took it, having been in the corporate world for 15 years or so. After about 8 years, I was working as a casual tutor, if you can believe it, among other things. And my particular interest became, why do students struggle to learn introductory statistic concepts? So about 10, 12 years ago, the School of Economics approached me and asked me would I be interested in becoming a teaching-focused academic, which I have been for the last 10, 12 years. So now I have a continuing appointment there, and my particular interest has come down to this idea of storytelling and teaching stats. So that's how it's evolved. So hopefully you enjoy the presentation. I'm particularly interested in the question time at the end and looking to see how you guys might be able to apply what it is that I'm going to talk about. So let's go. First thing I want to do is say, there's the heading, Storytelling and Teaching Statistics. I want you to think about those three pictures for a minute or so, have a chat amongst yourselves, pick one of those pictures and ask yourself, how does that link to storytelling and stats? What do you think? Why did I do that? Make a mental note. I'm going to come back to this as my last slide in 30 minutes. And let's see how close you are to what you're thinking now. So just make one note somewhere. What do you see? Okay, so keep that in mind and we'll come back. But I would start off by saying that is my story. Today I'm not interested about me, I'm interested in the student, but it has to start with me. So the presentation is going to have this in it. The focus is on the students, but I want to talk about choice. So if you're an economist in the School of Economics, you'll learn that economics is about choice. So my starting point is to give students choice in how it is they learn. I'm particularly interested in how to make abstract concepts tangible. More often than not, they remain intangible and you can't touch it. I'll talk about reflection a lot, previous life experiences, which I think come about because of my engineering background, and that's how I've really come to do this stuff, I think, and creativity. So you can kind of see the engineer in me in there, but hopefully you can see it impacts student learning as well. So keep an eye out for all these things as I go along. So the background to the talk today, I do many things, but I've gone after this area around statistics. So I'm talking about a large first year course of introductory students in a service course. So the School of Economics does the statistics for all the students at UQ in first year. So typically in a semester there's at least 500, typically 700 in the course. That's size. And of course there's pretty diverse learning needs because we have all of these people. From commerce, economics, engineering, law, business, so it's all over the place. So how do you pitch a course at these people? And I'm sure you're familiar with that challenge. But particularly what got into my head was, which equation do I use was a question I'm sure you've heard your students ask if you do stats. But in 2006, I particularly went after this. I heard it many times and I was working with students who struggle with maths, you know, the lower entry people. So it was a good breeding ground as a tutor for many years, and I did tens of thousands of hours of tutoring, put it that way, well over 10,000, probably closer to 20, which is ridiculous, but. So I wanted to figure out, how do you unpack this question? What does it mean? What's going on? Was there too much abstraction going on in this course? The FAR rate at the time when I took over this course was 60% for these students. Pretty soon that went to only 10% FAR. Was it a case of students being lazy? Someone said that to me the other day, which is the first time I thought about it in 15 years, because I never saw it as being lazy, which I thought was curious. But was it about surface versus deep learning, which is kind of hinting at laziness as well? So what did I do? I went to New Zealand and went fishing, as you do, right? So I came back from New Zealand. This is all about me. I'm just trying to set the background. And I came back thinking about seagulls and a single fish. And I walked into a class and started talking about the normal distribution. So the situation here is inferential statistics, normal distribution, confidence interval, sampling distribution, hypothesis testing. It's these areas that I'm interested in. So what is a seagull with a single fish in its mouth? Interesting. I started to talk about the normal distribution, and the variable was the single length of the fish, or the length of a fish. Pretty quickly that grew into talking about pelicans and freaky fish. Pelicans get a mouthful of fish, which is analogous to a sample. Freaky fish, well, Fukushima blew up, radiation, all the fish went freaky. So you can see I'm starting to tell a story, but these are very connected stories between many different topics. But it's all about my story. But students started to get a language talking about, oh, this problem's a seagull problem, or this is a pelican question, or this is a freaky fish question. So straight away, you're not talking about the sampling distribution for sample mean, or the sampling distribution for sample, what? So all of a sudden, there was this connection between, forget about the equation, but there's the equation, there's the character, there's the story. That took at least 5 years to evolve. It was hard. And I thought this could be too difficult for students to get their head around. So it's an evolution process, but in the end you do all the fancy maths and you can solve the equations. But you can see that there's either this horizontal link or there's a vertical link. Which way is it? One of my students that I've interviewed said, this is like a ladder that helps me climb to a higher level by having this analogy or these stories. But the problem with this is it's all about me. And it took me at least 7 or 8 years to realize, hang on, this is about me. And I thought I was taking a student-centered approach. So what do? You go and do a grad cert in higher education at UQ, because I felt as though, as an engineer, I understand how to design a high-rise building, but as a builder, you don't really know how to do that. So if I'm a scholarship of teaching and learning person, I need to get some tools behind me. And it was the biggest revelation in my life to do the grad cert in higher education. So I'd encourage you to do that if you haven't. So that very quickly flipped it around that, hang on a bit, you're not taking a student-centered approach, which I kind of felt. You're a teacher-centered approach and you're transmitting what you know to your students, which is not what I wanted to do. So as an assignment, I go through this action learning process, as you'd be familiar with if you are into the education stuff. So I saw the problem, I planned something, I acted, I evaluated, and clearly I reflected, because I'd been doing these mini action learning cycles for at least 10 years. So I wanted to come around to this idea, okay, let's come up with a student-centered approach using their storytelling. So this put me in a dilemma as to think, well, hang on, was all my bird and fish stuff just a waste of time? Was I just kidding myself? So I'm currently doing a thesis on this, which I'm just about to hopefully write up within the next year. So the research question was, and this came out of the grad cert as well, how do first-year stats students, that's the focus, construct their own stories to make sense of abstract stats concepts? So I'm interested not in me, but in you. How do you construct your own stories? Interestingly, I've interviewed lots of people and I was listening to some transcripts just yesterday or the day before, and my conclusion to that question was, how do students do it? They don't. Oops. They don't do it. But they can do it if you put something in place like the freaky fish story. That's what seems to be coming out of it. So To get a handle on this, let's just be boring and go and look at a couple of things in the literature, because I want to know, am I just kidding myself here? And Chris Wilde over in New Zealand, so welcome to the people in New Zealand that might be listening, maybe Chris is. People like gossip, which is what Chris wrote about, and telling little stories about the world. He talked about data stories. So there was this hint in the literature, not much. There's another guy called David Moore who started to talk about we construct knowledge using familiar situations and life experiences. I went, ooh, that's interesting. Constructivism coming out. And Moore also hit on this thing, that learning stats is like performing music. We can go after techniques, but that's not enough if you want to be a musician. It's about the feel of it. So I play a lot of piano, and I can tell you can practice and practice and get the technique right. But to sound right, you have to feel it. So how do you put all this into statistics? It started to make me wonder. So that was pretty old, but if you come to the recent literature on this stuff, the last 10 years or so, or even 2 years, Clark and Rosetta said that storytelling allows sense to be made out of chaos. Ooh, statistics is chaos. Through creating linkages to student experiences. So there's this idea that experiences matter, which is constructivism. So storytelling, according to Louise Phillips, who works in the education school at UQ, she's a professional storyteller. Ooh. Storytelling can help students connect their own life experiences to promote new insights. So you can build on what you know to learn something new. You go, oh, didn't cavemen do this stuff with stories anyway? What are you talking about? It's not new. Sure, but nobody's done it. And there's another idea. Jennifer Knoll, who I met just recently, I was in Kyoto talking about this 2 months ago. She came up and said that stats problems can be conveyed as stories with students' own narratives as a form of storytelling. So there are people in the world, I met a PhD student from Canada, from America, doing the same thing, but the trouble is they've written the stories and they're giving it to the students. Nobody is doing the reverse, as I'm looking at. So I'm curious about whether in other courses and disciplines, whether you can create stories from a student perspective and not yours. So how do you do it? So what I did this time last year, almost a year ago, I finally went after my idea of Mossbook. I'll talk about it in a sec. So I got 3 groups, 7 students who were previous students from my course, sat down and had an hour-and-a-half chat, semi-structured interviews. And I asked them to create a Mossbook, not Facebook, Mossbook, my own statistics story, which I investigated 12 years ago doing a grad cert. I said, how can I make this work? And I was that scared of doing it, it took me 5 years to have a go. Because I really thought this was too hard for students to get their head around. But I said, okay, I've got to try. So the criteria are quite detailed, but in summary, they have to create 2 A4 pages, no more than 200 words on what. It's around inferential statistics, but what they had to do in the end was use my scaffold. I didn't want to throw it away. I wanted to use the pelicans, freaky fish, seagulls type idea, because if I didn't, I discovered, well, where else to begin? It took me years to figure out how to do this. How do you expect a student just to say, okay, tell me a story? It's not that easy, it seems. So the Mossbook criteria, which I did first semester this year, was on the normal distribution and the sampling distribution. 1 page each, page 1 and page 2, no more than 200 words. Let's see how they go. Fair enough? So, what did I learn from doing this? So this is what I'm interested from your perspective. What can you take away from this talk today? So what did I learn? The first thing I did was I just got some 4th-year students who did my course 3 years prior. And I said, okay, guys, just give me a story that connects a single fish to a mouthful of fish, normal distribution to sampling distribution. You show me how to do it. So what they did was they said, okay, we can do this. We'll talk about sleepy students at college. So they went for it, and they came up with the language that had things in there like student welfare. These are economic students, right? Australian government guidelines, cognitive function. You go, what? So 4th-year students are really good at using the jargon that we've pumped into their heads. And these are the top students at our university, so it didn't surprise me. All their diagrams were just a replication of what I did in the lecture. There was no creativity. They were very good at giving back what they'd learned, supposedly learned, or should I say memorized. What they didn't do was come up with anything that was imaginative or creative like Freaky Fish or Pelican, because there was no instruction to do so. Just go and create the story. And they came back at me and said, oh, you know, stories is kid stuff, which you'd expect from smart people perhaps, right? They don't want to go there. But after an hour and a half talking about what they produced, they came down to the idea that, hang on a bit, maybe storytelling, they said, creates pathways for knowing, creating connections and applying statistics concepts in practice. They started to see that, hang on a bit, maybe there's something in what this guy's talking about. So, having gone through that experience, I said, rightio, let's try something different. Because I wasn't happy with that language. Because one of the graduate attributes, I don't care which university you go read any of them, and they say communication, or to be able to communicate effectively to whoever's out there in the real world. So as a structural engineer, I'm talking to the guy in the ditches, digging the dirt. Why is the cover to the steel 50 mil in the ground? I can't give him a technical answer. Or why is the reinforcement going this way rather than this way? I can give a technical answer, but that's not going to help them. So I changed the rules. PASS stands for Peer Assessed Study Session. Perhaps you're familiar with that. If not, doesn't matter. These are students that are fairly recent. They're only second or third year that are helping first year students. And they came up with a story about squirrels and nuts. The squirrels collect all the nuts in the forest and they stick them in holes in trees. How'd they do that? Because I said, guys, you got to now tell me a story that a 6-year-old kid will understand. No math symbols, no fancy words, lots of characters, and lots of ideas. So go for this creativity, which is higher order thinking. That doesn't necessarily mean it's got to be really cutesy characters, but it's got to be creative. People read that the wrong way, I think, sometimes. So the rules of Moss Book changed, and what they found was that it totally challenged them. They couldn't get away from what all universities seem to be doing, which is putting fancy pants and heavy words into people's heads, which is all fine. Don't get me wrong, because I do it as well, but I'm interested in how to communicate these ideas. So what they discovered was this untapped potential to explain difficult concepts. They'd never been there before. Why? Because we don't let them. So that stunned me. People who do economics and stats are not very creative. They're boring. Engineers, on the other hand, if I gave this talk to engineering people, we're all about creativity and stuff. So it was not unusual for me to do this, but in this situation it was. So I did it again. Having learnt from that, I reflected again. I did a third interview with students who just finished semester 1 and they'd just gone into the second semester. So they were pre-fresh. It was older people, slightly older, and now really newbie people who've just done my course. They decided to go after a family of bears, Mama Bear and Papa Bear. But the trouble was they started off with height of students is normally distributed, so we'll line everybody up from small to tall and we'll get a normal distribution. And it's like, no you don't, you get a straight line like that. Oh. These girls, 2 girls from Malaysia, international students, top students, straight 7s. We know everything about the normal distribution. Okay, let's see. So they sit down and I described that they went through 3 phases. It was pretty obvious when I looked at it. And one was what I call mental anguish, because they kept saying, I don't know how to tell a story about bears. And they were starting to get really worked up about this. I call that mental anguish. And then they calmed down a bit and they discovered this. Isn't learning just about getting a good mark? Duh. But then they realised that if I have to write this down as a story, maybe I'll actually learn something. So then the final thing was they realised they know nothing about the normal distribution. And until you realise and admit to yourself you don't know, then you might have a chance of actually learning. And I discovered that as a student way back, because I kept going to an exam thinking, I'll do really well because I know it. You come out and you don't. Grow up, you don't know it. You don't make stupid mistakes, yeah, or panic. That's just an excuse. So I was really tough on myself, and they got there. And it was through trying to create their own story. So is there something in this pedagogy that really taps into something that we're not tapping into? So here's what they did with their bears. Check it out. They got lots of baby bears, true, on the bottom. Then they stack the mama bears and the papa bears are on top. And they're going, hang on a bit, that's not a normal distribution. Well, why are you drawing it? What about if you did that? Oh, right. Now I see where I'm going wrong. And they could explain what the variable was and how it fits on a number line. But they couldn't do it unless they go through this process of pain. No pain, no gain. I think a lot of this is, we've all heard it before, but why hasn't anyone done it? That's all I'm trying to say. So, what do I do now? I want to try and summarise overall what have I actually learnt, so that you can probably take something away or come back at me at the end of this. What I think I've discovered is there's some shock factor that goes with your own storytelling. And when students realise it's okay, don't think it's this stupid stuff, then you can go somewhere. So I'd realised that, hey, maybe it's okay. Invariably, at the start of a semester, and I've interviewed people about this, you have to write a story. Oh, no worries. I'll do that with the night before and it'll be sweet. And then they go, holy smokes, this is hard. Why did I do that? It's not easy. If you don't believe me, pick your topic, go home, create a scaffold, some idea, and then see if you can do it. It will really challenge you. And the problem seems to be they can't get back to simple, everyday language. It's easy to talk about what you learn in lectures and regurgitate the stuff, but break it down, not so easy. But more importantly, because Mossbook is set within a context, you have to write about your life experiences. That was one of the rules I didn't really go on about. Students just aren't aware of what's around them. Statistics to me is everywhere. I see it all in this room because that's the way I think. So it actually forces students to get into statistics rather than just telling them about it. So what else did I learn? Frustration is a big deal. You've got to go through the pain of this thing. So you see the frustration of not being able to find a relevant context. Why is that? We're trying to train people to be statisticians perhaps, but I don't view it that way. Most of my students never do stats again in their life. What I'm interested in is, can you apply it? And I was just saying earlier, when I got married, the person at the reception was one of my students who gave me the best place at the particular restaurant. And she was a manager there who was using statistics because of these ideas, who was never actually going to apply statistics, she thought. So, yeah, it helps. Probably what I see as one of the big things, it starts to make you question what you previously understood, like this thing about the bears and the height. Starting to question yourself is good because you learn only when you change your previous understanding of something else, right? But in particular, I find that these students are doing stuff in groups. So what does that mean? They're actually laughing, having a bit of fun. You can imagine kidsy stuff could be a bit cute and quite interesting. So they get motivated, there's no doubt about that. But what hit me recently was some student from mainland China said, what's a pelican? Because they've never seen it in their life. So again, it just reinforces this idea, it's my world, what's your world about? So we're constantly telling people about our world. So I don't care about any lecturer who tells their own stories. And it's easy for people to tell their own stories. And people who talk to me about this get it wrong. They think, yeah, but everybody tells stories. I don't care. I'm not interested in that. It's about what students give back. So here's some pictures of what my students have created. That one about pencils I thought was particularly good because they went to a kindy and kids love using the yellow, right? They wear it down and they see the different length pencils. The variable there is the length of a pencil. So you can generate this normal distribution idea, but the sampling distribution, these are things called threshold concepts. They're really tough. But the student here was smart enough to get all the little kids' pencils, chuck them all on the floor, then randomly pick them up and put them in pencil cases, the same number. What do you think the average length of pencils in the pencil case look like? Like, you don't use any fancy words, but they had to create that. I thought it was brilliant. There's books and there's dogs digging bones and there's waves. This one here is a bee, stripes on its back. And an entomologist told me that stripes on backs of bees can go to 3 to 6, and he stacked them in beehive boxes. It was really cool. Others do Barbie dolls. There's things in about Steve McQueen with his lap times and guys with dragons and shells on beach. Come on, that's not me. That's students. The top left corner is Samantha and the Beatles. That student is now working with me to write the entire statistics textbook as a Moss book. She was that much into it. Like, come on. So we're doing research projects with my students and publishing papers and creating material that goes into the course. So some students are really into this stuff. It's fascinating how she's transformed. The key point is, though, does it work? Or am I just full of it? There's a great distribution. It's a bit hard to see perhaps for the last 5 years in this course. This has been analysed. We've written papers, done the econometrics. I can tell you that exam for 5 years is effectively exactly the same, no change, got permission to do it, secretly guarded and all the rest. The last green bar, 32, is the number of sevens, and you can see it was the highest ever. More importantly, down the bottom, you can see the number of 3s and 4s. The 2's actually reduced, and everything, if you look at it, shifted to the right. In other words, I'm pretty convinced that that as an intervention has had a pretty significant impact. More importantly, the fail rate, don't forget, that percentage is on 700 students. That's a bit of a drop in the last year when we used Mossbook. But if you drill into it, more importantly, that looks even more impressive. There's a multiple choice question deliberately set up in the exam, used the last years. Why is it that it's jumped? Answer? Because with Mossbook, the students are telling me they recognise that was a pelican problem, not because of me, but because of the bees, the pencils, and all the rest of it. So what's going on? I'll talk about that in a sec. Here's another question. Oh, sorry. The reason they could do it was either a seagull or pelican question if you look at that question. And the trap was I gave both answers, but a lot of students couldn't differentiate. They went for the seagull answer rather than the pelican answer. But clearly in that previous slide, they were getting it for the first time, really. Another question on confidence intervals, and guess what? Ooh, new picture, it's a shag. I didn't tell you about the salmon and the trout and the crabs and all the rest of it, right? So the whole course is set up as a story, not atomistic, where you put it in silos and you do this bit, okay, let's do the next bit, and just doing this processual type process. This is a story that connects in your brain. So, did they like Mossbook? 90% said it's beneficial. That's pretty impressive on a sample of 400 out of 650 students. Not only that, 80% said, keep doing it. Yeah? So not only from my perspective, from their perspective, they enjoy it. So what are my conclusions? The question was, how do students use their own storytelling? How do they construct their own stories to make sense of this stuff? So if you put in here the student storytelling, plus their life experiences to try to link the abstract concepts, what do you get? You get the realisation of not knowing what you thought you knew. Try and swallow that one. So it exposes you in a big way. And it helps you grow up and realise what it is you're actually doing. Most of us just memorise stuff. As an engineer, I've learnt I cannot do that or this building falls down. But in other disciplines, it doesn't seem to be like that. You can just get away with it. Just get a good mark, no problem. But what student storytelling discourages is rote learning. You can't get away with it by storytelling. You've got to know what you're doing to write that story. But more importantly, it encourages this idea of creation that relates to your personal situation. What's a pelican? I don't know. We'll create something you do know. Don't just take it from me. So I talk about operationalising sense-making and deep learning. We all say, yeah, let's deep learn. How do you do it? This is one trick that might actually help you do it. And I talk about creating these mental models. So, what are my recommendations out of all of this, which is what I'm particularly interested in after this now? What are you going to tell me? I reckon it allows, I'm going to suggest that what you do, and what I will be doing next semester, is start off with a really low stakes game in the first couple of weeks, just to help students get the feel for this, and to send a signal that you actually value their input and their creative ability. And I don't see that happen too often in a lot of the courses I'm exposed to. Then as a second attempt halfway through the course, and this is what I'm going to do, I'll introduce the lecture 5, lecture 6, which is really hard. So what a lot of the students were telling me was that, oh, look, the 6 and 7-year-old language is a bit hard to start with, and they're focusing more on, you know, trying to get the story right rather than trying to get the concepts right. So I think if you start off a little earlier and then introduce it a second time, you can probably get more bang for your buck that way. So use this two-stage process, what have I said, to build confidence, opportunity to find mismatches. And this is the thing, there's some sort of conflict happening. You know, people talk about metacognition and all that stuff, but I'm not going there. So you've got to go through this wrestling process, which I realised I did with my seagulls and freaky fish for about 5 years. It's not good enough not to make people suffer. Once they suffer, they learn. And that's what they tell me. Probably the most important thing out of this talk is this scaffolding idea. Looking out my window yesterday and coming down the plane, it dawned on me, as an engineer, what is a scaffold? It's pretty simple. It's a support work. So when you pour a slab, this floor, there's formwork underneath it. That's a scaffold. So what does the scaffold do? It's just there to hold the wet concrete. When it gets hard, you get something that's new. So in other words, my freaky fish and seagulls is a scaffold. The concrete slab is the students learning that they take away that exists forever. The scaffold disappears. You strip the concrete, it's gone. So I think what the magic is, sure, the lecturer can tell their story, create the framework or the scaffold, but don't stop there. Then hand it over to the students and let them come back at you. And only in that way are they going to actually learn. That's what I'm seeing that storytelling does. So, returning to my picture, you may have had a thought, how am I going for time? Right on, I think, a little bit early. Why did I do this? Because I tried to sum up in a picture what I just said in the last 20 minutes. Traditionally, the forest is there, and there's a learning pedagogy at this university and every other university in the land. Sure, everybody's trying to find a new way, so that's what I do. I come in and I use disruptive stuff, and I'm clearly trying to upset people's thinking in this room to move away from this teacher-centered approach, which we know. But how do you do it? I haven't talked about, you've got to incentivise Mossbook, which is give it an assessment mark. So I made it 5%. 95% of students handed in that assignment out of 700 people, so they went for it, even at a measly 5%. The other aspect of what's going on there is I believe in what Sadler said, is that assessment is the learning. Assessment is not a test of what you learn. And at first year, a lot of stuff is set up so that it's a test, but at a postgrad level, it's not. So why don't we do it at the undergrad level? So I see assessment as the learning. So students are creating the stories together, bouncing ideas off each other. So the other picture is, here's my support, here's your story. So they're mapping my world into their world. The seagulls and the pelicans, they're trying to map it across to their context, and then they come back and they keep going around this circle. There's this reinforcing happening. So in your brain, those pathways are becoming solid. And in the end, you strip that away. I've got what I need. So in the end, that's what my sunshining is. They don't need all that traditional stuff. They need to be able to create their own stuff to get deep learning. So to sum up, how does storytelling, or how do students construct their own stories? They use my stuff as a scaffold, but in doing so, they go through this, I think I know, I really don't know, and what's the last one? Now you know. Thank you very much. Time for some questions.
Thanks very much, Carl. That was fascinating. And those three panels made me think of my old film studies days. It's like a classic narrative structure of a sitcom. You got your equilibrium, disequilibrium, and returns to equilibrium.
Freeze, what is it? Melt it, refreeze.
That's it.
Change. Lewin's model.
Yep, very good. So it's a classic narrative model there.
Yeah.
Okay, any questions in the room?
So I'm particularly interested in how does it apply to your world? I'm interested, does this go in other disciplines, if you can go to that? Yep.
Oh, hang on a sec. Can you intro yourself?
Hi, my name's Peter, and I'm actually also a civil engineer who worked in 15 years and then's now gone into education as helping develop the civil engineering course.
Right.
But I also have a 6-year-old daughter.
No.
So I'm listening to her talk going, well, that's both my worlds. And often at night I sit thinking there, how can you reconcile teaching adults at a higher tertiary level and teaching my 6-year-old maths? And I often wish, so when I explain to adults, I try and give a story when I'm doing an example with the maths, so instinctively, but also trying to teach my 6-year-old maths, you've got to strip the language out, you've got to strip the terminology out. And recently we went away and she missed a bit of school. And the teacher contacted me and said, you need to teach this maths concept of reading maps. I said, how do you, exactly that concept of tying a story to it? She's got a concentration span, you're half an hour. And basically where we stayed, I've done a grid over top of the plan from Google Maps. And then she used to tell a story. At A2 was where we stayed. And then every morning we walked down to C5 and had breakfast. And then we went to the pool at E6. So I was really encouraged to hear that that concept used as 6-year-old is actually effective for teaching adults at a tertiary level, and I'd be encouraged then to use that in the classroom.
Okay.
And uni.
Thanks. Yeah, just as a comment on that, there's a lot of medical companies. I just read, one of my students sent me an article in the US where big medical companies are translating all their gobbledygook so an 8-year-old can read it. I thought that was interesting, 8 to 10-year-olds. So the customers are unable to understand what it is they're trying to do. So they're breaking it down.
Carl, I really enjoyed it. I'm dead molten. What it did, of course, is reinforce the fact that with our learning, we do learn through storying. We've done it from time immemorial as people, but also visually. we have that. If we have something visual, it has a much stronger impact of staying in our brain, in the primitive part of our brain. But also, when you have to put things into your own words is when you really do come to that deeper understanding or learning, not just regurgitation. And that's when you have to go back into your memory and draw the things out to make those connections. And Garth Boomer, who was a wonderful educator here in South Australia, used to always say that you only learn when you're off centre. You've actually got to pull yourself back onto centre. And that's where that happens. And that lovely sort of angst, and then you get that light bulb moment, and that's when you know you've actually understood something. So I think your story for us today is great. I've always known that we learn through storying and sharing, but it's often been the teacher's story, giving the story or the analogy about something, trying to make the bridge between the student and the concept that you're wanting. So what you've done is added another dimension to really consider, and I think it was great. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, I think I just submitted an article along this line to an economics journal, and they wrote back to me and said, yeah, but this isn't what really matters. Go back and review what the teachers' stories are. There's been lots of stories about how we teach economics by teachers, and no, you're missing the whole point. That's exactly what I don't want to do. So, yeah, it's very, I don't think anything I presented here is that radical. Perhaps this idea of mapping my idea onto something else in your world and coming back, that's probably the only new thing. But all the ideas that you've heard about, the way we learn, visual, it's all there. I don't think that's what's new, but actually doing it and implementing it and trying to make it work, I don't see people trying to do that because I've discovered it's hard. It's not so easy. You just try and imagine telling your story, your students to go and write a story to explain a concept in engineering, like bending moments in beams or something, right? How are you going to do that? Well, sit down and think about it, and you can, but you have to keep going back to the theory and keep questioning yourself and challenging yourself, and that's the magic. And that's the learning, but we don't have these processes, it seems to me. I could be wrong, especially in other disciplines.
Thanks. There's a question from online from Diana. How did you go grading the stories?
They were worth 5%. There's a marking rubric, 5 criteria, 2 marks each. Tutors marked them. I said, don't be too tough on them because it's 5%. But it was pretty clear, anyone in the 8, 9, 10, the average is about 8 out of 10. But it's pretty obvious they get it. But I would argue that nearly every assignment I looked at, I could say it's not right. But that's good because then the students, I've actually had students come back and ask me that I've interviewed, and they've gone away and completely rewritten it because they said, this is rubbish. And it got 9 out of 10. So you don't want to discourage them, not for 5%. So I wasn't too stressed. But as a learning exercise, they went back and did it again. And there was at least 2 or 3 students who saw me who did that. And their second attempt was much better. So I'm not too stressed at 5% because you're going to get a 7 whether you get 0 for this or not, because you're going to get 94%. So next semester I'm looking to up it to 10%. So the game will slightly change if I do that. And my ultimate aim is to get rid of a mid-semester exam and make 30% for MOS books. So I'm moving away from the traditional, let's do an exam. That doesn't prove to an employee you know a heck of a lot, really.
So in the course, did you speaking of scaffolding, did you have any information or support for the students about storytelling or story writing or narrative studies or anything like that?
Not as such, but I had 2 A4 pages of the requirements of what it is you had to do, specifying you weren't allowed to use the word average, and you try to use the normal distribution without talking about the average. Well, there's a thing called the centre or the middle. So yeah, or the guy with the bees, for instance, he lifted the beehive box when he looked at a sample and said, most of these bees have got 5 stripes. So what he was doing is actually using the mode as the middle in a symmetrical thing, which is true. So you can find ways around it, but you have to discover that for yourself. So yeah, there are instructions as to what to do, which I'm happy to share with people if they want to use that.
Thanks. Do we have any more questions from in this room? No? Oh, someone is typing. Rebecca. I'll just give Rebecca a moment to write her question. Although a few people have said how much they enjoyed the talk, and Michael is saying that the Moss book is a very refreshing idea, so perhaps Michael will borrow, plagiarise.
Yeah, look, I'm happy for anyone to have a crack at this. If you want to get in touch, I'm more than happy to share my marketing.
Okay, yeah, that was my next question.
Because I've got people in Malaysia who are using their students there who are doing a bridging course to get the UQ. I'm already working with a lady in Malaysia. There's a girl in the UK and a couple of people in the States that are interested in what I'm doing. So I'm more than happy to collaborate with anybody who wants to go at it. Hang on. That's right.
My name's Anne, and I'm just thinking about what you mentioned with international students. A country like Singapore would embrace this wholeheartedly.
Right.
They pride themselves on producing some of the best engineers in the world, and yet they're struggling with how to generate a more creative approach, even from the primary school level.
Yeah.
They're really digging deep into experimentation on how to do that and educating teachers in a new way. For the Moss book, this could be something that I know the National University of Singapore would be very interested in.
Okay.
Happy to make the link.
Talk to you at the end of it, maybe. Yeah, I have actually spoken to some people in Singapore, but in the polytechnic type stuff, so economics, not engineering. Yeah. And I think the engineers that I have seen who are doing this are pretty good at it for some reason. They're happy to step across there, or maybe it's that creative side, I'm not sure.
Hello, my name's Nicole. I teach marketing, and our concepts perhaps aren't as abstract as stats. I'm not a nice statistician. I love what you've said, and I understand. But I'm really struggling in my own mind at the moment. How could I incorporate something like this into a large first-year similar numbers marketing course across the board? When I get the students to tell me their experiences because they live. They consume and buy products and do that. So they'll tell me constantly about their own experiences in the real world of what they do, but I'm not quite sure how I could pull this in.
Interesting, because I've done many years of marketing as well, so I know 4 Ps and consumer behaviour and stuff, so I haven't really thought about that. In particular, I've gone after this because of the abstract idea. So, but I'm sure within marketing, like you talk about the disconfirmation model and expectations of consumer behaviour, for instance, that, it's a hurdle, meet and exceed customer needs. Yeah, perhaps there are some complexities in there that you might be able to simplify. Because I'm sure when they heard the word disconfirmation, you go, what's that? Right? So there are some trickier type words. So I'm familiar with Lovelock, for instance, in marketing. So yeah, but the point is, I think the starting point is like any research, is what's the question? And so you've got to really go after what do students struggle with, which is where this all began for me, was which equation do I use? So in marketing, you must be seeing, or in any other course, what is the fundamental struggle that students have? And then try and unpack that and go after that. So I'm not sure what the problem in marketing would be, but it's almost like set up, it's in very much box type fashion. Is there any connection between all the ideas? I know your marketing plans and that try to build all that in. So I'd have to think more about it. But certainly within, whether it's physics or engineering or psychology, there must be other courses that have abstract concepts. Yeah.
Thanks. There's a question from online from Diana. It's following on from your question. Do you think it'll work with other disciplines or just maths?
I really think it's going to work with other disciplines. But I haven't fully explored that, so I have no reason really to say that. But my sense is that it's there, just because storytelling is so pervasive in everything we do. Yeah.
Well,
So,
I mean, you contended that storytelling is a universal way of learning, and so
Yeah.
so the implication is yes, it would work with other disciplines.
I think so. Well, just
Yeah.
think about how it is that you're lecturing. Why do you go in and do a lecture, and what are you trying to convey? Are you just transmitting stuff? We don't need to do that really today with all the technology and stuff we've got. So we're all doing blended learning and trying to find new ways of doing things, and that really does focus in on, like the lectures today. We're designing lectures now where all the stuff's online. You turn up and you get 3 questions in a live lecture. What are those 3 questions? It must be what is difficult, and that's what you're going to explore. So if that's the case, you must be able to then create some moss book around that. That's how I would see it.
Yeah, in general terms, we encourage our staff to apply, topics and concepts to real life experiences, and students tell us that this is a kind of stickiness for them.
Yeah.
So there's some cognitive process going on there where students, I mean, I'm not breaking any new ground here by saying that students enjoy it when staff apply things to real life concepts, and it really, adds meaning. You put it in the context of meaning, and this students, it sticks in their mind more. They learn more from it. So this is not new. You're just taking it to another level.
And I think that's what you see in these, Australian award winners. If you go through and read and watch, like Simone was here recently, if you go and look at that, they're all about this real world concept, sure, and a lot of people do that. But typically they're looking for what's the next level. And I think, that's what this moss book and these pelicans and freaky fish. But I think the next level, even again, is not about me. It's about the students. And it's just reversing it back out to get it to come back from the students. That's the magic. Because I think we all go in and we talk about our experiences and it sticks. But it'll stick even more if you turn it around and use that idea of scaffolding and then pour the concrete. It's the concrete I'm interested in, not about the scaffold. We provide the scaffold. That's why I see it.
Okay, thank you very much. If there's no more questions, we'll give a round of applause to Carl.
Okay.
And what was a
Thank you
very
very much.
interesting topic and very great presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.